2 years ago, when Alberta Premier Jason Kenney launched the inquiry into the Anti-Alberta Energy campaigns, or the Allan Inquiry, as it's known after its commissioner, Steve Allan, I predicted in a couple of columns that it would be a total disaster. Well, little did I know that little could I have predicted that it was actually much worse than that, as anybody who's followed this debacle will know. But the latest, which is the release of the draft report to the environmental groups who are supposedly being investigated, is the cherry on the sundae. And I'm going to talk to Keith Stewart from Greenpeace, because his group was one named in the draft report, and he's seen it. So welcome to the interview, Keith.
Thanks for having me.
Well, look, you've read the draft report. I have not. So I'm going to let you give us an overview. What's in it?
So we didn't get to see it all. We got to see selected sections of it. Didn't get to see his recommendations. And each organization got to see the section specifically on them. So I got to see Greenpeace Canada's and portions of the main report. We're not supposed to release the document. The commissioners told us not to, but we have, well, we'll be posting soon on our website, our response to it, because this is a very odd public inquiry. There's been no evidence put on the public record. He claims his report is based on interviews he's done, but he refuses to say who he interviewed. He won't even give the names of the people he interviewed. There's no summary of those interviews. There's no transcript. There's no opportunity for us to cross-examine. It's a very odd thing. But so it's basically the main parts of his arguments around what he's saying, and it's all over the place. Like if I've been teaching university for 25 years. If one of my students handed me this, I'd hand it back to them, say, you can rewrite or fail. Like, those are your options. He opens by saying very clearly, the groups that I'm about to name as Anti-Alberta have done nothing that is unlawful, dishonest, or can in any way be impugned. So he's saying, basically, legal terms, you didn't do anything wrong. And then he says, when I say you're anti-Alberta, you've engaged in anti-Alberta energy campaigns, I'm simply using that as a geographic descriptor. So you shouldn't take it as in any way a negative label. But of course, anyone who's watched this process play out knows that it's entirely designed to be a negative label. And I mean, you could easily call it something else. Why call it anti-Alberta? So the things that really alarmed us in the document were there's still lingering bits of kind of climate denial. He commissioned reports back that he published back in January, which were outright climate denial, basically saying climate change does not exist. Anyone who claims it does has a secret agenda. And they are working on behalf of this global progressive movement led by a bunch of people whose names I don't want to mention because I don't want to fuel those conspiracy theories against those individuals, but the usual suspects. And they're seeking to impose, in the words of this report, Chinese-style technocratic socialism. This is not a particularly credible argument in any sense.
So Keith, bottom line, anybody supposedly being investigated by this public inquiry has now been exonerated. I mean, you haven't done anything legally, morally, or ethically wrong. And I don't know where you go from here then, because what was the point of the inquiry, and why even bother issuing a report if that's the conclusion the inquiry is coming to?
Well, he starts off with saying, you've done nothing that I can claim is, a problem legally or that was dishonest. But then there's a bunch of innuendo in the report. So one of the things we've asked for him to remove from the report is there's a whole section where he says, it was very, how Donald Trump always said, people are saying, and then he would say something outrageous. So he would say, you can't say I said it. I'm just telling you people said it. So in the report, he says, people told me that these environmentalists their motivation was they're socialists, or they're trying to impose one world government. They told me that they're just in it for the money. All of it, there's probably some truth to all of this, but I didn't have the time or resources to be able to determine whether or not that's correct. But I suspect it's partially, there's some truth in all of it, which is a remarkable statement to make. It's like hearsay, I'm just going to repeat a bunch of allegations for which I provide absolutely no evidence. And then say I didn't have time to investigate it, even though I had 2 years and $3.5 million.
Okay. We've seen the reply of other groups, like the Dogwood Initiative released a statement that explains, their side of it, and made the point, and I think you'll be making the same point most likely, is that the entire section on Dogwood was basically based on Google searches and gossip, and it sounds like that's essentially what you're saying.
Yeah, so it's as he says at the beginning, this is all based on public records, basically things he could find on the internet. Um, the the one that made me chuckle was he was citing the War Room as one of his sources. In the Greenpeace section, he actually cites True North News, which is kind of like a fairly right-wing scandal thing. Yeah, so it's not like he didn't do it. And the remarkable thing is he never spoke to any of the groups he was investigating. Our lawyer wrote him 3 letters saying, hey, we hear you're investigating us, let's talk. Never replied to any of them. And then we get these documents, and then we have like less than 2 weeks to actually respond to the hundreds of pages and dozens of background documents. And then he's supposed to integrate all this into his final report, all these submissions from 20 some groups, maybe 30 or 40, into his report in 2 weeks. So we're kind of wondering, is he really actually honestly seeking feedback or not?
Okay, so I think that we can, based on everything that I've seen and what you've told me, and what was apparent 2 years ago, because viewers who aren't aware, I wrote the first debunking of Vivian Krause, whose foreign funded activist conspiracy narratives were the basis for the inquiry. So I followed this, neck deep in this story for quite a while now. So anyway, this is all it's unfounded and appears to be set up as a political witch hunt, which I think was one of the arguments I made 2 years ago. What now? What do you do after this report comes out and it is structured essentially as you've described? What do you do?
So we've made a submission saying, here's a bunch of changes we think you need to make. And part of that is to actually acknowledge that climate change isn't kind of like something some people care about. It's, the Supreme Court has said it's an existential threat to human life and communities. Evidence from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the International Energy Agency saying, if we're going to deal with climate change, we need to vastly reduce, phase out fossil fuels. So we're saying you actually need to include this in the report, and a bunch of the stuff where you're just kind of like making these repeating conspiracy theories and saying there's probably some truth to this, you really got to take that out. If he doesn't, then we'll have to address it then. I mean, one option is to pursue a judicial review of the report, to basically go and say, look, you didn't follow the rules of evidence, you didn't follow the rules of due process. There's the wrong thing is there's no kind of sworn evidence in any of this. So one possibility is a judicial review, but it's also, I kind of think this is going to drop with a thud because it doesn't find any of the things that Jason Kenney promised it would find.
Yeah, Professor Martin Olaczynski, who's on the faculty of law at the University of Calgary, has written a fair amount about this, pointing out that public inquiries have to follow very strict rules. This is to avoid the appearance of being a witch hunt for that very reason. And there are all sorts of principles and guidelines, in legal theory and so on. Anyway, and the inquiry appears to have breached, many of them. Okay, so all of that, you ask for a judicial review. At some point, do you sue?
I mean, the judicial review is a kind of a suing. The question is whether or not we want to waste more time and money on this. And we haven't made that decision yet, or every organization is going to have to make that on their own. This has, actually hasn't sucked up nearly as much time and energy as I thought it would, because it was basically ran silent for 2 years. And then kind of popped its head up, and it's eaten my life for the last 2 weeks. But beyond that, we've mostly been waving at them saying, hey, are you ever going to talk to us? But I think part of what we're saying is, look, we make no apology for the fact that we were advocating for action on climate change. His report says, anything more than asking for more data on climate change is an extremist position, and it shuts down debate. One of our concerns is the current report as currently written has little snippets that could be pulled out and said, oh, he's the commissioner has found that they're all secretly socialists or something like that. This is what the public inquiry found, and that can be used to inflame, sort of like the internet trolls, but also concerns about people's safety in real life. So what we're saying is, don't include these unfounded allegations, which you have no evidence for, because parts of it look like it's written so Jason Kenney can read out a line on the campaign trail, or certain groups can sort of put this out as memes on the internet. And if you don't read the full 300 pages of the report to see that it's actually bunk, this is actually dangerous for people, and it's actually a disservice to democracy to try and use a government inquiry, the full force of the law, to intimidate your political opponents. And that's what Jason Kenney has tried to do here.
The power of the state should not be used to intimidate and to suppress dissent. Yeah. Energy media has made that argument over and over again over the past 2 years while this was going on. And I see all of our concerns 2 years ago have come to fruition. And this is a danger to Canadian democracy if it, hopefully it doesn't get repeated, but it's bad news. Anyway, thank you very much, Keith. Really appreciate your insights.
Thank you.